I know that wheat and gluten issues are a real issue for a lot of people. It's a physical issue, there's sensitivities, it's a hard topic. Some of my best friends have eliminated wheat, and we're not, we're going to try and have some practical ideas at the end of this. But I hope neither of us come across insensitive about it. I think the real issue is just trying to uncover the truth, really. And I think this is, the other thing that I think is really important to emphasize as we start as believers in the Bible, as believers in Messiah, is why we think that it's good to have some healthy skepticism about criticizing wheat. What's the big deal? Well, I'm going to give my quick points. These are the things that kind of pop into my head, is that in Genesis 1:29, those are the primary foods that God said, I give you for food, and that includes wheat. God commanded his people to celebrate a wheat festivals and barley festivals every year. That's Pentecost and Passover. That was a commanded thing to celebrate. God commanded his people to eat unleavened bread to celebrate Passover. God commanded grain offerings in order to worship him. And of course, Yeshua, is the bread of life. So that kind of all pops into my mind when people are criticizing wheat. And I can't get much further than that. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to Sue. Help us out here. Where do we go from here?
Well, we for sure share many of the same concerns. Those are my exact things. Jesus compared himself to bread. So how could bread be wrong? He even compares himself to wheat. So what's wrong with wheat? And I have to know the truth. And I think as Christians, our responsibility is to know the truth, not just accept things at face value. First and foremost, I have to say I'm a Bible-believing Christian, and I'm assuming that this audience is not offended by that, but that's where I come from. And unfortunately, much of the information in the realm of healthy eating comes from an evolutionary viewpoint. This whole hunter-gatherer philosophy is based on the idea that man has evolved over millions of years and did not start farming until much later in the evolutionary chain. This one took me a long time because I've even seen, to put my finger on what was wrong with that, because I've even read books by Christians that talk about this hunter-gatherer idea. And while I do not deny that there are people groups that are more agricultural than others, we all know that, the Bible tells me, however, that farming and agricultural living has been around since the beginning of time. As a Christian, I embrace the worldview that creation and the human race began as we know it, as recorded in Genesis. And
okay, Genesis, wait, you know what, Sue, let me just for people who aren't exactly familiar, I just want to clarify what the importance of it is most or a lot of the wheat criticism is about, can you just give us the one sentence? A lot of the criticism says we didn't start eating it until thousands of years later. That's the premise or the foundation on which a lot of the criticism is based. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. That is the premise.
Okay.
Some, go a little bit step further and then they'll say, well, wheat's not what it used to be. If maybe they don't totally embrace the whole evolutionary thing of millions of years, or maybe they even do, but they'll go a step further and say, well, the modern wheat, and we'll get into that in a little bit, is not the same. But this hunter-gatherer that people for millions of years hunted and ate fruits and seeds and wild game and didn't eat wheat, and we have now not evolved into a people that can eat and tolerate wheat.
Okay.
That's just not correct information. And it took me a while because I kept seeing this hunter-gatherer terminology. And like I said, though I knew there were people that were not very agricultural, just something wasn't right.
Is that the paleo diet?
Pardon me?
Is that like the paleo diet?
Yes, actually the paleo diet, but even the Wheat Belly book. I mean, he mentions it. Even Jordan Rubin mentions in his book the whole hunter-gatherer idea and concept in a couple of places. But it's just really not scriptural. In Genesis 1, it tells us, in the day that the Lord made the heavens and earth, it says, before there was no man to till the ground. When God created Adam and Eve, he placed them in a garden, and he instructed them to tend it. So when did gardening and farming and agricultural start? It started with Adam and Eve. The first mention of bread is in the punishment on Adam because of his disobedience. God told him, by the sweat of your brow you will eat your bread. The first son, Cain, was a gardener. It says he was a tiller of the ground. The first biblical mention of bread made from flour is as early as the time of Abraham. He told Sarah when he wanted to feed the angels, he said, go, get flour, make bread. My final authority on everything that I believe and on anything that has to do with eating, living, whatever, will be the Bible. So for me, the whole hunter-gatherer basis for eating and many other, bases for eating is unscriptural. God created and he gave us food to perfectly nourish our bodies. He knows how our bodies work, and he knows what they need to be healthy, and he made the food to give us those nutrients. I kind of put it like this. He wrote the owner's manual, so he knows what we need. He caused the earth to bring forth that food. When we alter God's design and plan, we discredit him, we discredit his wisdom, and we will suffer the consequences. Jesus compared himself not only to bread, but to wheat, for a good reason. This is something that absolutely astounds me. Of all the nutrients needed by our body to support life and maintain health, there's only 4 missing in wheat. Grains, including wheat, are the most nutrient-dense food group God has given us. I challenge anyone, do a nutritional study, just of the vitamins. Look up vitamin B, vitamin A, vitamin D. Look up the irons, the minerals. Look up all these individual vitamins and start looking at the food sources. You're going to see grains everywhere. And I have great concerns when diets eliminate entire food groups, especially ones that God has declared as good for food. It's very concerning to me.
Wow. Amen. That's amazing. If you ever have if you're ever looking for a job, Answers in Genesis would probably hire you, because I feel like you just did. We don't even have to go any further, but we will. We'll keep going. But I think that's a great, so believers out there who are criticizing wheat, at least consider these things as you test the information that you're looking at. All right. Now we've talked a lot about wheat. And I think before we move on, I think it's important to clarify, what kind of wheat are we talking about? Wonder Bread is made from wheat, right?
Yes,
what about Wheat
correct.
Belly's references to healthy whole grains? Help us get our terminology straight.
Yes, that is very, very important, because it's a source of deception in the grocery store. When you go there, food manufacturers will use made from whole grain, or like Wonder Bread. It's made from wheat. It was even made from whole grain at one time. That doesn't mean all the whole grain is there. So I've studied healthy eating and nutrition most of my adult life, even after graduating from college in 1976. And I've studied more from science books than from whatever diet or nutrition fad was popular at the time. But in 1991, I was introduced to a whole new concept of healthy eating. And I'm just got to tell you, it radically changed my life and the life of my family. I learned about the health benefits of whole grains, particularly the idea of making my own freshly milled whole grain flour. Never knew there was a way to do that. I bought a little in-home grain mill, which we now sell as our business. And I've been teaching others about the health benefits of freshly milled whole grain since 1992, and I've literally seen thousands of families' lives change for the better. In 1991, what I learned that so changed my life was I learned about the history of white flour, the common diseases that plague this nation, and how they're directly related to our consumption of this white flour and commercially processed flour products. Most people don't realize that all commercially milled flour in the United States today is made on these huge steel rolling mills that were actually invented in the late 1800s.
Wait, Sue, hold on. Are you with? Hold on one second. If you're listening and you've thought, well, I don't eat white grain. Listen again. Sue's talking about all commercially milled flour. This is what she's about to tell us is not just related to white flour. It's related to
Right.
all flour. So listen up, even if you think you're eating healthy by eating whole wheat. Okay, go ahead.
Well, what happens is, like I said, all commercially milled flour in the U.S. is made on these huge steel rolling mills that were invented in 1800. These roller mills sift the bran and germ portions away from the endosperm. The endosperm is the inner part of the grain that's the white flour portion. White flour is basically protein and starch. Most all of the vitamins, minerals, fatty acid, and fiber are located in the bran and germ portion. The bran is the outer surface, the germ is the interior, where the life of the seed, where the sprout comes from. The removal of the bran and germ leaves the white flour virtually devoid of nutrients, except for the protein and starch. But in the early 1900s, when the new white flour took over the market, making white flour and white bread food now for the masses, for the first time in the history of the world, white flour, white bread was made available to everyone. Well, 3 vitamin deficiency diseases became epidemic in the United States. So health officials were puzzled, went to the millers going, what's going on? We got to put the bran and germ back in. They said, no way. We will enrich the flour. So enriching the flour was necessary to replace the nutrients that were lost, but for the more than 30 nutrients that are lost with the removal of the bran and germ, only 4 are returned. 3 synthetically produced B vitamins and iron. Actually, a 5th nutrient was added later. Folic acid has been added because of the rising incidence of birth defects. Chlorine-derived bleaching agents are used, as well as dough conditioners and flour conditioners such as potassium bromate. And these are all unwelcome additions, and they wreak havoc in the health of our bodies.
So just to be clear, then, what they did is they took out the bran and germ.
Yes.
And then a lot of problems started. And then this enriching did not put the bran and germ back in.
No.
It was something completely different they added back in. They didn't add back what was missing. They added back something synthetic, and that was not helpful, basically.
And not only synthetic, but they didn't add everything back. There's no way. For the 35 to 40 nutrients and counting, I mean, who knows all the things that have not been labeled, the phytonutrients we call them. They only added 4 nutrients back, 3 B vitamins and iron, and then years later they added a 5th one. And so even flour labeled whole grain is not what we think it is. In the Wheat Belly book, he keeps talking about healthy whole grains and repeatedly talks about healthy whole grain bagels and waffles. But I have to emphasize over and over, there's no such thing really as healthy whole grain processed products in the regular grocery store. When those steel rolling mills came on the scene and displaced all other milling processes, like I mentioned before, today, that's it. All commercially milled flour is made on these steel rolling mills, which separate the germ and the bran and the oil away from the white flour. Virtually all those vitamins, minerals, fats, and other nutrients that are contained in the bran, they're lost. The bran and germ makes up about 28-30% of the kernel. They're totally removed in commercially milled flour. So what they do now to make whole grain flour or whole wheat flour, the components are recombined to form these different flours. Most people don't realize that, and most people think that whole wheat flour from the store is the same as what you would get if you milled the flour yourself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Whole wheat flour is not even a legal term. It's produced by recombining the ground bran with the white flour. The germ is typically left completely out, as well as all the oil, because the flour would go rancid. So that bag of whole wheat flour that I was using all those years prior to learning about milling my own grain, I thought was truly everything. All the bran, all the germ, all the flour. That's not so. There's no legal specifications required for this labeling, and most people think whole wheat means whole grain. When whole grain terminology came on the scene a number of years ago and it kind of became a cool thing, it actually became a legal term. they had to come up with legal specifications to allow food manufacturers to label something whole grain. So, again, the steel rolling mills separate the bran and germ and the white flour. Those are the mills that commercially ground flour, that's what they're made on. So to make whole grain flour now, the white flour has to be recombined with the bran and this time the germ according to some legal specifications for flour to fiber ratio. Now, gluten is a bad word these days, but I'm going to explain to you more what gluten is. It's actually the protein portion of white flour. But gluten can be completely extracted from the white flour. It's a washing process that the gluten can just be totally extracted out and separated and isolated. And even though white flour is predominantly gluten and starch, the extracted gluten is not considered flour by legal standards. And so then, even though this whole grain flour has to have this correct fiber to flour ratio, extra gluten can be added because it's not considered flour and to this whole grain flour product. So this greatly alters the fiber to flour ratio of the whole grain product. Did that make sense? Are you following me there? This is a big deal. This is an unnatural amount of gluten in these healthy whole grain products, whose consumption will not give you the desired health benefits, if any at all. The isolated gluten is also found in many other non-bread products, such as soy sauce and taco seasoning, just to name a few. But I think it's important to mention here, though, that gluten, as it naturally occurs in grains, is not a bad guy, any more than we now realize that cholesterol is not a bad guy, as it naturally appears in eggs and fats and, butter and meat. But gluten is the naturally occurring protein component of most grains, and it actually contributes several value amino acids to our diet. Amino acids are the building blocks of all protein. And protein foods are important as they supply the body with these needed amino acids for the necessary functions in the body. And wheat is actually considered a very good source of these vital amino acids. So I hope that explains a little bit more. Gluten in and of itself is the protein portion of white flour. It is not a bad guy, but in abnormal amounts, isolated out, then it wreaks havoc and causes problems. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And I think also clarifying that whole wheat flour is not the same as whole grain. That I only learned like in the last year from you, that what I was buying in the store and thinking was healthy, that whole grain flour is not the same as whole grain flour. And it makes sense because when we teach that the reason that they did it was for shelf life, then the natural question should be if white flour has a good long shelf life, why can store-bought whole wheat flour sit on your shelf? So I think freshly milled whole grains being different than whole wheat flour is important.
Right. I tell people not to even go down the bread aisle in the grocery store because there's nothing healthy down there. But if you do, I just challenge people, read those labels. I mean, there's so much deception in labeling. Whole wheat, made from whole grain, multi-grain. That's a term and they'll sprinkle some oatmeal on top. And color it brown. What do you think when you read multi-grain? Oh, well, this is better for me. Read those labels. A lot of times that's nothing more than white flour with coloring and some oatmeal dusted on the top. So we've just got to be informed.
Exactly. So let's start with the big one here and back up just a bit for those of us who haven't read the Wheat Belly book. Give us a calm and clear introduction just so people know when we refer to the Wheat Belly book what it is.
Well, it's a New York Times bestseller. I think it's been on the bestseller list for 2 years now, written by Dr. William Davis. Its basic premise is, and these are his words, I've actually seen him interviewed, and he states that wheat is the world's most destructive dietary ingredient. wow, we'll get there in a minute.
Don't go there. Don't go
Wow, I mean, I can hardly read that without laughing, but claims that wheat is the perfect chronic poison. That's another quote. And pretty much in this book states that most all health issues can be resolved or reversed by simply eliminating wheat. So
All
that's
right.
it in a nutshell.
All right, don't go there yet. Hold on, girl. Well, the reason we wanted to do that I wanted to do this is since this book came out is I have heard a lot of passionate devotees of this book bash me for my hesitancy to ditch it. In talking to some friends, I've been called deceived and in denial for not wanting to wholesale abandon wheat. I can't imagine, as a wheat professional, how much you have heard this. So I've picked out a couple questions. We're gonna just hit a couple, and we want to hear your thoughts on them. The first point that I want you to address is this confusion about hybridization, one of the main points of this book. And when you're talking about the hybridization, also, just educate people on genetic modification and what the difference is. And, just the questions that I get all the time is, well, I know that this wheat is not like what our ancestors ate. So, why this doesn't concern you like it does the author and a lot of the people who read it. Let's just start with that.
Right. And I understand some of these concerns, and I have concerns too, but we have to just dig and we have to get to the truth. But I just have to say, Dr. Davis, the author of The Wheat Belly, uses, in my opinion, sensationalism to its fullest effect. And it incites fear in readers, and he coined terms such as synthetic wheat, Franken wheat, implying that the modern wheat is some kind of reproducing machine gone bad, and he makes unsubstantiated claims. For example, one of the things he claims in the book is that 5% of the protein in the modern wheat is unique to the variety, meaning that they are found in neither parent. Let me just say this. Plants, animals, whatever, this is genetically impossible. Plants can only express proteins that they have the genetic code to produce. Environmental conditions can sometimes cause or inhibit the expression, but the plant cannot code for proteins that aren't there. Okay? To simplify this, put it in layman's terms, let me just explain it this way. And this may be an oversimplification, but let me just explain it this way. You cannot have a blue-eyed child if there is no gene there for blue eyes. It's impossible. You may not ever have a blue-eyed child even if the gene is there, but you absolutely cannot have a blue-eyed child if there is no gene. And that's just one of the things that he states, but he continues to state that wheat has been modified by humans to such a degree that modern strains are really, this one really made me laugh, are unable to survive in the wild without human support. Really? First of all, there's the use of the term modified. To the concerned reader, they just read, even though it wasn't there in print, what went in their brain. Genetically modified. Just the use of that word. To me, that's very confusing and deceitful. Then to say that modern wheat cannot survive in the wild is nothing short of being ridiculous. We are not talking about a wild animal here. We're talking about that's, been domesticated and lost its natural survival instincts. We are talking about a plant that needs water, soil, and sunshine. To me, when I was thinking about all this today and over the last couple of days, it brings to my mind the scripture Matthew 6:28, where God says, "Consider the lilies of the field and learn thoroughly how they grow. They neither toil nor spin." So really to say that this wheat can't survive on its own without human intervention that's just really pretty ridiculous. To obtain higher yields, the modern dwarf wheat that we have today may indeed require heavier nitrogen fertilization, but without this fertilization, the crop will most definitely survive and it will yield an adequate crop. It just won't have the increased yields that it was bred to do. to have. In fact, the dwarf wheat was developed to direct its energy to produce wheat instead of a large plant and to grow in areas with less desirable soil and growing conditions. Most anyone that's a flower gardener probably knows very much about this. I don't, if you ever bought fertilizers or plant foods to feed your plants, most of us probably do more organic, but at some point you may know that you don't give your flowers high fertilizers because then they just make bushy plants and they don't make flowers. That's the same thing here, and that's what this wheat was bred to do. And Dr. Davis actually contradicts himself. A few pages later, he actually states that this dwarf wheat has short stalks that reach maturity more quickly with less fertilizer required. He just said before that it couldn't grow without fertilization. But the use of terms genetic modification and hybridization, or even the term modified in the same sentence and paragraphs and discussion, is very confusing and misleading to the reader. If you go back and you read through his statements more carefully, because this is the big thing that we get calls after calls after calls. Is your wheat genetically modified? We've heard that the modern wheats, they're all genetically modified. If you go back and read the book, you'll never see that he clearly ever states that the dwarf wheat is genetically modified. He just uses the terminology all intermingled with the sentences and arguments. He also often even cites problems with other truly genetically modified foods such as soybeans as his examples for his argument against wheat. He'll make an argument against wheat, but the example that he gives is soybeans. This is deception at its best. And despite the implication in his book, the modern dwarf wheat is not a result of genetic modification, but of traditional plant breeding techniques. I really want people to understand that. The modern dwarf wheat was developed by crossbreeding. Strains of wheat to produce a seed with, yes, higher crop yield, and finally crossing the variety with a Japanese dwarf wheat. This produced a shorter plant that would not bend under the heavier heads of grain. The higher yield made the grain heads heavier. The wheat crop was bending over, and then the heads were ending up on the ground, and they were rotting. So the crossbreeding was done with wheat to wheat, unlike genetic modification that crosses genes from other organisms. Totally unnatural.
So, Sue, just to be clear then, what was done to wheat is no different than what was done to my raspberries that were created in California and somehow made it to Richmond, Virginia, and are still perfectly round and firm and juicy. They're organic and they're not genetically modified, but no doubt they have been crossbred in a way that a juicy round one was crossbred with a sturdy one that gives us these perfect raspberries. Is that?
Well, yes, you crossbreed. It's been done since the beginning. You see a trait that you like in a plant or a fruit or whatever, and you see a plant over here that has something, and so you will cross them. And it's a natural plant breeding technique. And just for the record, I have to state this. I am totally against genetic modification in our food. But for clarification, I have to state emphatically, wheat has not been approved for genetic modification in the United States. There is currently no genetically modified wheat grown commercially for commercial use in the U.S. I hope everyone heard that. And wheat has not been approved for genetic modification in the USA. I think it is important for us to realize something. The U.S. is the largest exporter of wheat in the world. Mexico and Japan are our largest importers. There is widespread global resistance to genetically modified grains throughout the world. Other countries won't import genetically modified wheat. Okay. This is a big deal. If U.S. is the biggest exporter, these wheat farmers in this country have resisted the development of genetically modified wheat because they won't be able to export their wheat. So, and actually there were some trials going on, but the trials were dropped in 2005, and government approval was never even requested because the farmers have consistently resisted the development of genetically modified wheat. The last trials were supposedly done in 2001. Now, you may have heard in the news recently that they found some genetically modified wheat in Oregon. This finding has actually outraged wheat growers. They don't want their crops contaminated any more than we do. So to say that this modern dwarf wheat, or to even imply that it's genetically modified, is just false information. And it's a huge fear thing. I mean, we have customers calling every day, and it's getting more and more and more, and insisting that wheat is genetically modified. I'm sure, or I am concerned as anyone, that it will come, but it's just not there. And so there's so much more I could say right now on the subject, but I would just encourage listeners and readers everywhere to be informed, seek wisdom. You know, the internet's out there loaded with information. Google beyond the first or second or third page, because unfortunately so much of the anti-wheat and anti-gluten propaganda is all coming right now from this Wheat Belly book. You know, fear is a tool of the enemy, not of God. And that's what I see, is that fear is being generated and confusion is being generated. One more point before we move on. Organic, by definition, cannot be genetically modified. So if anyone's in doubt, buy organic.
Amen.
Great rule of thumb.
Absolutely. So just to be clear then the hybridization we're talking about is not, the hybridization of wheat could probably, probably any item in the produce section of your grocery store has probably been subject to hybridization as the wheat has. That is a very good explanation. I think that was helpful. Our next point, probably even the bigger point for a lot of people, is the notion that the book brings up that wheat makes you fat.
Oh, my good gracious. Nothing could be further from the truth. I personally have studied the history of white flour and the consumption of white flour and processed grain products, and I've just read statistics and studies and scientific studies that say just the very opposite. Dr. Davis makes a bold statement in the Wheat Belly book, and I'll quote it. It says, "The proliferation of wheat products in the American diet parallels the expansion of our waste, and the advice to cut fat and cholesterol intake and replace those calories with whole grains that was issued by the Heart Association in 1985 coincides precisely with the start of a sharp upward climb in body weight for men and women." Now, I want us to keep listening now. I'm reading this quote, and I don't want anybody to get bogged down because I'm reading it, but listen to what he further says. He further states that, ironically, in 1985 also marks the year when the CDC began tracking body weight statistics, tidily documenting the explosion in obesity and diabetes that began that very year. Now, I hope everybody heard that. I know there was a lot of, sometimes it's a little busy and we can't follow everything. But what he's basically saying is that the proliferation of wheat products in the diet parallels with our expansion of wheat. So as wheat consumption has increased, our waste, and in other words, our weight has increased. He's saying that when the Heart Association suggested that we quit eating fat and cholesterol and replace that with whole grains, that coincides with the drastic increase in our weight. And he says then that 1985 is the year when that happened, marks the year when the CDC began tracking this. Now, did you hear what all that just said? There's something very simplistically wrong with this statement. If the CDC only began tracking in 1985, how is it possible to know that that is when the explosion in obesity started? Do you see what I'm saying? How simple this is? Yeah, you read something and we go, oh my goodness, what was happening before 1985? Could it perhaps have started our obesity and our weight gain much earlier, maybe in the 1970s when a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet was first introduced by Dr. Robert Atkins, which what we also must realize, these diets such as the paleo diet and the wheat belly diet, they're nothing more than a high-protein, low-carb diet by a different name. Because though Dr. Davis in the Wheat Belly book goes against wheat, and it appears that he hates just wheat, and he talks about some of the ancient grains, if you read all the way to the end, he really doesn't want you to eat any grains at all. But getting back to this whole wheat makes you fat thing, statistics that I have read has the health of America dropping drastically in 1978. We were ranked 79th out of 100 nations studied as far as our health. But in 1980, we had dropped, in just 2 years, we had dropped to 95th out of 100. All of this is prior to 1985. The real truth is, and I did some heavy digging on this, is according to the USDA Economic Research Service, wheat consumption has actually drastically declined in the last 100 years. What? In 1829, wheat consumption averaged about 225 pounds per person per year. It dropped steadily, bottoming in 1972 to an all-time low of only like half, less than half. It was 110 pounds per person per year. There was a slight increase up until 1997, but according to this Economic Research Service, the 10-year growth ended in 1997 because of the adoption of, guess what, the low-carbohydrate diet, leading again to a decline in wheat consumption. Rapid at first, but reaching again a low in 2005. In 2011, the estimated consumption of wheat is only 132 pounds per person per year. That's, again, almost half of what it was 100 years ago. So, and another striking change is when wheat flour, the wheat flour use in the past 100 years. 100 years ago, home baking accounted for 90% of the total flour consumption, with commercial bakeries only using about 10%. But in 1945, the bakery portion rose to 60%, and by 1990, less than 10% of flour was consumed in the home. What does that tell you? That tells you that processed flour consumption has increased, but as one can see from the facts that I just stated, the statement presented in the Wheat Belly book that obesity and wheat consumption coincide doesn't match up, since wheat consumption has actually decreased while the obesity rate has increased and our waistlines have increased. What I think is very interesting is Dr. Davis, whose diet is a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet, fails to mention that both sugar and meat consumption have risen drastically since 1950. Interesting also is the fact that by 1980, this dwarf wheat that's supposedly, according to Dr. Davis, making us all fat, it was accepted worldwide to prevent food shortages and hunger in other countries. China's wheat production greatly increased. Mexico's wheat production greatly increased because they adopted the dwarf wheat. If wheat is the problem, and particularly if this dwarf wheat is the problem, why have China and Mexico and other third world countries who all use this wheat variety, why have they not seen the decline in health and the rise in obesity in America? Something else truly must be causing the problem. So we have to be careful when we draw conclusions from data. In fact, when I went on the internet looking for all kinds of statistics and data and things, And it was funny, I found one that said chewing gum sales have increased in the last 50 years, and running shoes sales have increased in the last 50 years. You know, what he's saying is about as ridiculous as saying, oh, well, then running shoe sales have increased and more people are wearing running shoes, but people are getting fatter, so buying running shoes must make you fat. It's about that ridiculous. And I don't want to be too ridiculous here, but anyway, that's
that's great.
We have to be really, really careful when you draw conclusions, and I have to be too, because I do draw a lot of conclusions and a lot of parallels to the consumption of white flour to the health issues that plague this nation. But I've done it not only just looking at statistics, but actually going back and say, looking at heart disease and high cholesterol and going, what's missing in white flour and what is what is in real whole grain, freshly milled whole grain flour that would make someone's cholesterol drop 85 points in a month when all they changed was their bread. And that's one of our number one testimonies is people cholesterol, triglycerides, all these things dropped drastically in just 1 month. And all they changed is started milling their own grain and making their own bread. I'm diverting a little bit here, but so we have to look at statistics, but then at the same time we've got to go back and look at science books and go, what would be in this wheat that would cause this to happen, or what would be in this food that would cause this to happen? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Another point that he brings up that's kind of interesting to me is he says that when he devises a strategy to help his overweight, diabetic-prone patients reduce their blood sugar most efficiently, and he says this, the quickest and simplest way to get results would to be eliminate the foods that cause their blood sugar to rise more profoundly. Now, what would you think he would eliminate? I would think sugar, but he says, in other words, not sugar, but wheat. First, let me reiterate the fact that commercially milled whole wheat flour does not contain the entire components of the wheat kernel. And he consistently brings up healthy whole grains or healthy whole wheat. Again, the wheat germ and the bran is removed as well as the oil. And with this removal, a valuable portion of fiber is lost. Fiber has been proven to slow the absorption of sugars released from carbohydrate digestion. Fiber is also a cheap belly filler. Fiber fills you up. You eat an apple, you can't eat 10 apples, you know. You eat bread, you can't eat a whole loaf of real whole grain bread. Yes, the stuff that may be labeled whole grain in the grocery store is, but he uses the glycemic index as an indication of what foods are healthy and what are not, and what he tells his patients to eat to eliminate that blood sugar rise and of course, in turn, then result in weight loss. So he cites that white bread, Wonder Bread, and whole wheat bread all have the same glycemic index. He even says that whole wheat bread has a higher glycemic index than even sugar. Now, what the glycemic index is, for those that aren't quite sure, it's a measure of the absorption and the sugars released from carbohydrate digestion. Okay, so basically the higher the glycemic index number, the worse the food is. The more rapid rise in blood sugar you're going to get. The lower the number, the healthier the food, because the lower rise in your blood sugar you're going to see. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So he states that whole wheat bread has a higher glycemic index than sugar. Well, if you look at the glycemic index chart, and you can go online and look at these charts, you see that white bread has like 71 glycemic index, Wonder Bread has 73, and whole wheat bread all have the same glycemic index. Whole wheat bread has 71. Well, these numbers certainly seem to confirm the above statement in the Wheat Belly book. But if you keep looking, you will find some very interesting numbers that for some reason Dr. Davis fails to mention in the Wheat Belly book. 50% cracked wheat kernel bread, which is going to have your whole kernels of grain in there, has a glycemic index of 58. 100% whole grain bread made from a reputable bakery that I actually know that uses whole grain flour, the glycemic index is 58. Last but not least, whole wheat kernels, the whole grain itself, has a glycemic index of 30. This is extremely low. If wheat is the problem, then why these low glycemic index numbers for the real thing? And why did Dr. Davis leave them out? Again, let me emphasize, there is no such thing as healthy whole grain in the grocery store. The only way to get real whole grain bread and bread products is to make them yourself from flour that you have milled for yourself, or from a reputable bakery that mills their own flour. My son opened a bakery. We now own a bakery, and he grinds his flour every day right before he makes the bread. But any commercially made flour product is made from flour that has been processed and sifted. Dr. Davis also states that wheat is an appetite stimulant. This is not what I have seen over the past 21 years in ourselves and in countless others who have made their own freshly milled whole grain flour from the whole kernel of grain. Sugar cravings virtually disappear and appetites are completely satisfied. So let me just tell you this right away. Wheat will not make you fat if it's real whole grain. Whole grains will not make you fat, quite the contrary.
It will not. Absolutely will not. Although around here, when I do make whole grain bread and serve rolls or something at dinner, we sometimes look at it and laugh and we say, "Oh, a butter delivery vehicle," and then we'll slather it with gobs of butter, and it's totally delicious. But obviously, if you eat the whole loaf with a whole stick of butter, that'll make you fat, right? So,
Exactly. And I've read study after study after study that actually shows that those who consumed the most whole grains actually showed less weight gain over years. There was like a 12-year study done, particularly on women. And they watched women, and they said consistently 49% less risk of being obese and weight gain if they ate at least 3 servings a day of whole grains. So
right,
it's just really not true. And I just can't tell you how many people have come in my store. I mean, one lady just last week came in and showed me before and after pictures, and she says, "You changed my life. I started grinding my own grain and eating predominantly." I mean, most of them are eating predominantly wheat because that's the king of bread making. And she said, "But I just started eating real food. I've lost 88 pounds.
Wow, that is awesome.
I've had, customers tell me 150 pounds. And it's just if you saw pictures of my kids, none of them have wheat bellies. And,
right.
So.
And I just have to say, Sue, for being a mother of 9 children and 8 grandchildren, is hot. Like Sue is like, definitely not overweight.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. You're so funny.
You know what? I want to make sure we have time for practical information, but can you first, before we jump into a little bit of practical, before we go, I want to hit the other issue that a lot of people have is not weight related, it's digestive. So before we hit the practical, can you hit a little bit on the digestive?
Absolutely. I have spent the last 20 years studying and teaching on the healing and cleansing effects of fiber. My kids and my family call it my poopy talk. I go through digestion and elimination and the whole bowel system, and I just cannot stress enough how important grain fiber particularly is for the cleansing and the healing of your gut. We have seen just over 20 years, we've seen serious digestive and bowel disorders completely reversed. Some as in as short a time as a day, others in 2 to 3 weeks. I mean, I've taken muffins and a loaf of bread to friends that told me they were about to be scoped for cancer, that they had irritable bowels so bad that it was like turning on a water faucet. And in 2 weeks, just from me taking them bread every couple of days or muffins every couple of days, completely normalized bowels.
Well,
And
what about the Wheat Belly book, though? The Wheat Belly book talks a lot about, it's not so good. What's the difference?
I know it just consistently, and this is just not what I have learned over the years studying science books and textbooks. What I have a problem with in the Wheat Belly book, or one of the things, so much of the information presented in the Wheat Belly book uses the response of celiacs to wheat and to gluten. Celiac disease is a very serious condition where the person is unable to digest gluten. There's a particular portion of the gluten, what is gluten? It's the naturally occurring protein in most grains. Most grains have gluten. It's not just wheat. Wheat's the king because gluten is what helps bread rise and be fluffy when you make yeast bread. So that's why wheat is the most popular grain to make your yeast bread out of. But so celiacs are born with the inability to digest this gliadin portion of the gluten that's found in grain. For a celiac, consumption of gluten causes serious bowel-related problems. Because you cannot digest it, it literally lays down the villi in your intestinal tract. Any food that cannot be digested will cause such issues. But for a celiac, it's gluten. And just over and over and over in the Wheat Belly book, and I challenge anyone that read it, go back and read it again and you'll see what I'm talking about. He consistently uses the effects of gluten on celiacs. What else would you expect? But, so, do you understand what I'm saying? For a celiac.
Right. Well, and remember,
gluten is, of course, going to cause a problem. But celiac
before you go on, can you just,
less than 1% of Americans. Right. Less than 1%. So, the rest of us, probably most of America has digestion issues. But if gluten is just a protein, and if you're not a celiac, then you shouldn't have trouble digesting wheat.
Okay.
But so we have digestion issues. So the problem is we need to get these digestion issues corrected. If you're not a celiac and you have trouble digesting wheat, then work on getting your digestion improved. The most important factors in gut health is cleansing and restoring. Cleansing involves eating foods that will promote proper elimination, which one good bowel movement every day is the absolute minimum, and gentle scrubbing of the bowels. And grain fiber is the best source of grain that scrubs gently. It's not harsh if it's eaten in the context that God created it. So grains are the best food God has given us for this. And then restoring involves getting that gut bacteria back in there. We do this by eating good fermented foods that have live organisms that will naturally populate our gut. Yogurt, kefir, real kefir, and I'm not talking about, I say the green glows in the dark and squeezes from a tube stuff that you buy in the grocery store. I'm talking about a real good yogurt, a natural yogurt that we sweeten with honey or put our own fruit in. Kefir that you make yourself, raw milk, natural cheeses, fermented vegetables, or even a good probiotic supplement. I'm going to tell you right now, that is one supplement I take every day. I just take my probiotics so I get that good bacteria in there. And what most people don't realize is these organisms play a critical role in correcting and preventing food intolerances. We have to ask ourselves, what in the world is going on in our country today? When I was growing up, I didn't know anybody that was allergic to food. Now, it's everywhere. And but this good gut bacteria or it's not just bacteria, it's gut organisms. They clean up undigested food. They produce enzymes to help us digest food. They help us absorb nutrients from our food. It's endless. We've got to get that good bacteria restored.
Okay. So that sort of dovetails the digestive things. Again, as I opened with, there are so many people who have, quote, issues, and you're starting through cleansing and restoring, it sounds like, is sort of a good big picture on how people who have issues can start to deal with them, but let's see, I just want to make sure that any other practical tips for people who are feeling desperate. I mean, that's the tone that I feel like I hear from people, who believe they can't eat wheat. Like,
right.
Where do you go from here?
Well, and that's, I know I'm hearing it a lot too, Hope, and I have a feeling you are too. People say, well, I read the Wheat Belly book and I quit eating gluten and I feel so much better. And the first question I have to ask is, did you go from processed foods to the grocery store to no wheat and gluten, or did you go from milling your own wheat and making your own bread to no wheat? If it's the first scenario, of course you're going to feel better. You're going to lose weight as well because you're giving up exactly the foods that I recommend giving up, the heavily processed white flour, sugar, empty, calorie-laden, even if it's labeled whole grain, the junk in the store. But if you've been milling your whole grains and you find that you feel better without wheat, then maybe you do have a sensitivity to gluten, or maybe you have some sensitivities to other things in wheat besides just gluten. There's other things that there could be causing an issue. But here's what I want to encourage you with. There are plenty of other grains to choose from. I mean, people think, I can't eat wheat. What am I left with? Spelt, kamut. These are ancient grains that most people that can't tolerate wheat, that have wheat sensitivities, and I'm not talking about a celiac, but I'm talking about someone that just says, I just don't feel as great when I eat wheat. Most of them can tolerate spelt and kamut with no problems at all. I even know of true celiacs that can tolerate spelt, but I don't deny that sensitivities exist, but they possibly are not permanent. Now, celiac disease, true celiac disease is permanent, but we got to get those gut organisms reestablished. Eat lots of grains. There's so many to choose from. It's just as easy to grind your own barley, spelt, rye, kamut, rice, quinoa, amaranth. I mean, there's just so many grains. Wheat is not the only fish in the sea. So many people may be sensitive to gluten without being a true celiac, but if you truly need to go gluten-free, then there's even more important reason to grind your own gluten-free grains. There's rice, there's millet, buckwheat, sorghum, corn, teff, amaranth, quinoa.
And I just want to. I'd like to make the point too. Like, I feel like a lot of people who have made the choice to avoid these things go to the gluten-free section of the grocery store, which, if we come full circle, is filled with products of genetically modified ingredients, which I just think is satanic, because I feel like it's driving people, this belief is driving people from these other options directly to the exact things that might be causing issues.
Yes, and in the long run, I can't remember the numbers that I was reading today, but it's like the gluten-free, to go gluten-free and to eat the products in the store, you're only getting like 6 grams of fiber a day, and the recommended amount is like 25 to 35 grams of fiber a day. So, and then you're going, and most of the store-bought gluten-free things, they're all made with white rice, which has it's no different than white flour made from wheat. And it's loaded with starch and lots of sugar, and it's devoid of like I said, of fiber. And then there's even, I was doing some reading, and there's some statistics about rice being genetically modified. But I do feel led to share just an encouraging testimony of several years ago, a lady who had heard me speak about the importance of milling her own grain. She found out she was sensitive to all kinds of grains right after she had heard me. And when people hear my testimony and my teaching, and I encourage people to go on our website, and we can give that information at the end, to get our free CD where I share the history of white flour and the common diseases that plague this nation, and show how they're directly related to our consumption of white flour and why wheat has the nutrients that can change all this. But so she was totally convinced, but when she found out she had a sensitivity, she was very upset. But so she just asked the doctor, well, what grains can I have? And in her words to me, she said, I ate massive amounts of those grains that I could have. Freshly milled, of course. And because of the cleansing and the healing properties of real whole grains, 1 year later, she retested, and she had no sensitivities at all. That's amazing to me.
That is awesome. Well, I think we covered those 3 points and hopefully some practical tips for people. Just as we wind up, our concluding thoughts. When I first bumped into you, we both had some pretty strong language about, who and what was behind this deception. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. I was probably on a roll that day.
So, I think it was your words that talked about this deception coming from the pit of hell.
Yeah.
But you know what? Let me hear some before I do my wrap up. Let's hear your concluding thoughts that you'd like to leave people with today.
Well, this is actually, in thinking about that and wrapping up, I do. Before I just totally get on my soapbox, I do want people to be encouraged and to find hope. God has given us just great foods to nourish our body, and grains are the most nutrient-dense food that God has given us. I am very concerned about the anti-grain propaganda that's out there. And I was thinking about this today as I was thinking about, kind of what you had shared with me, that you really wanted me to make that point because I had shared it with you. I really thought about this. For more than 100 years, grain has been so altered that what we've seen is almost the complete degradation of a nearly perfect food. And white flour, in my opinion, and I believe scientific opinion, has made Americans constipated, sick, and obese. So for 100 years we've had that. And then all of a sudden, government studies show that whole grains reduce the risk of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Okay, so now whole grains come on the scene, and everyone's pushing whole grains, even, whether it's true whole grains or not. But now all of a sudden, even the health food enthusiasts are saying, oh, no, grains are bad, grains are bad, grains are bad. It's almost like there's this evil scheme behind all this. So first it's grains have been denatured, and now when grains all of a sudden are trying to be accepted, some evil plot is now telling us that they're bad for us. Are you hearing what I'm saying? So first something makes them bad and alters it, God's perfect provision, and now that we're trying to grasp hold of God's perfect provision, everything's coming at us saying, oh no, it's bad, it's going to make you fat, it's going to make you this, it's going to make you that. Like I said, it's almost like there's this evil scheme to keep God's people unprepared. I've been studying healthy eating now for more than 30 years. I've tried lots of dietary changes over the years. I've never seen anything bring as much change, immediate, very noticeable, and lasting health benefits of all the things I've tried. And the thing is, it's so easy. And what else is really cool? It's a healthy food even a child will love. Because what grieves me to no end, and I see adults do this all the time, they get to be 45, 50 years old, and they start going because they have high cholesterol, they're obese, they got these health issues, and they go, we got to start eating healthy. So they start eating the salmon and the salads and the real fruits and the real vegetables, and their kids are still popping out of the microwave the chicken nuggets and the mac and cheese and the hot dogs. This is, I'm ready to start a campaign, No Child Left Behind, but with a whole different meaning. From the slogan is, Isaiah 55 verse 2 says this, why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your earnings for what does not satisfy? Now, I'm not paraphrasing. That is straight out of God's Word, Isaiah 55, verse 2. And if you were like me before I learned about healthy eating and real bread and real whole grains and what was done to this perfect food that God has given us, I didn't know. But I'm telling you, and I believe with everything in me, there is coming a day when whole grains, real whole grains, might be the most reliable food we have. In fact, it may be closer than we think. I believe there's coming a day when we're going to need a reliable food. You know, God told Joseph to store grain for a reason. Grains are storable, left whole and intact. That is a seed. It will be just as nutritious next week, next month, next year, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now. No other food group can be stored like grains. No other food group. You can can fruits and vegetables, yes, you can freeze them, but no other food group that I know of can be stored at room temperature and not spoil. And I think it's very dangerous, this anti-grain propaganda. Is going to put God's people in a position of being unprepared. And if that is correct, then we have to believe this is a conspiracy from the pit of hell to get God's people unprepared. You know, when in the days of Joseph, when there was a famine in the land and Jacob sent his sons down to Egypt to buy grain, a lot of us don't realize that he sent them down there with gifts of food. They had food in Israel, spices and herbs and certain things. They just didn't have grain. You know, I find bread scriptures everywhere in the Bible, but one of the most enlightening ones to me I found in Deuteronomy 24, verse 6. God has laws for borrowing and lending. And in those days, if you borrowed something from someone, you had to give them something of value as a pledge. But God says in Deuteronomy 24, verse 6, do not take a man's upper millstone as a pledge, for you would be taking his life. Wow. In the scripture, God equates the capacity to mill your own grain with your life. And then a great promise, one of the best I've ever read, Exodus 23:25 says this, I will bless your bread, and I will bless your water, and I will take sickness from the midst of you. That's God's promise to us. And it's our responsibility to be informed and not to let anyone take away our upper millstone.
Wow. I just got chills for like 5 minutes. That was so good.
Well, I'm pretty passionate, you can tell,
right.
but I've seen it, I've learned it, I've read it. So I just want to encourage people, be informed.
Amen.